Good afternoon. My name is Jo Marie Griesgraber. I'm the Executive Director for New Rules for Global Finance, and it is our pleasure to co-sponsor a series of seminars with the Heinrich Böll Stiftung of the German Green Party. I will let Nancy Alexander introduce the Heinrich Böll Stiftung. What I will do first is I'm going to introduce the panel, and our focus today is on the, I need this. Our focus is on the transparency and accountability of the G20. And we thought it especially appropriate to do this on the actual day when the G20 summit is taking place, because decisions are being made, or should be being made, on behalf of really the global community. And are these the right people to be in the room? Is it the right process? Do they have enough authority? Do they have too little? So we're going to consider a lot of governance issues. And you're not surprised that New Rules for Global Finance focuses a lot on governance issues. We focus not just on the G20 increasingly, but also we've done considerable amount of work of the Financial Stability Board, which we call the quintessential black box, because no one knows what it is, where it is, or what it does, or who's there, but they're making decisions on our behalf, and you'll be happy to know that a new working group on transparency and disclosure has just been established, and it's comprised of all people from the banking sector. Of course, who better to regulate the banking sector? That is sarcastic, in case anyone missed it. Okay. I will introduce the panel in the order in which I suggest they speak. First is Ms. Nancy Alexander. I've known Nancy for a very long time, and her quintessential area of expertise has been the World Bank, and now she has mastered the G20 with all of the brilliance and tenacity that she has previously devoted, and I'm sure she continues to devote, to the World Bank. She's the director of their economic governance program. The foundation works in 30 country offices to build the capacity of the country and the capacity of their partners to influence government positions on G20-related issues. Nancy has participated in civil society preparations for summits in, are you ready? The United States, Canada, France, South Korea, and Mexico. I'm sorry, she missed out on the UK. I mean, just, as well as something called the Think Tank 20, or the T20. You're going to learn about the T20 and the B20. New words, new acronyms. She writes and edits many G20 publications, most notably the bi-monthly G20 update. Here's your exhibit. Since the mid-'80s, she has been engaged in research, education, advocacy regarding global institutions, especially the IMF and World Bank. She's worked for U.S. House Financial Services Committee, the ILO, the Bank Information Center. I knew her when she worked on the Friends Committee on National Legislation. For 10 years, Nancy founded and directed Globalization Challenge Initiative, and before that was Director of Global Relations for Bread for the World. Her degrees are from Duke and Harvard. Next, I would like to invite, so if you have your bios, this is going to keep you awake, flipping back and forth. I'm going to invite Bernardo Luczynski, who is a senior advisor to the executive director of the Southern Cone within the IMF Executive Board. He's been there since 2008. He's Argentina's representative to the G20 International Financial Architecture Working Group. He's a senior advisor to the executive director at the World Bank before his position at the IMF. He has held various positions at the Ministry of Economics and Production in Argentina, who is Dean of Business Administration at the Universidad Nacional de 3 de Febrero, has taught development economics, macroeconomics at several Argentine universities, such as the Universidad de Buenos Aires, de Belgrano, del Salvador, de La Rioja, y de 3 de Febrero. And he's been a government advisor. He has Masters in Arts and Philosophy in Development Economics from the Institute for Social Studies in The Hague, which is in the Netherlands, which is not the same as Holland, in case you learn as slowly as I do. Then I would like to invite Ms. Thea Lee. Thea is Deputy Chief of Staff at the AFL-CIO, co-author of A Field Guide to the Global Economy. At the AFL-CIO, she was previously Policy Director and Chief International Economist, where she oversaw research and strategies on domestic and international economic policy. Her bachelor's degree and master's in bachelor's degree is from Smith, master's degree in economics from University of Michigan. Research includes reports on the North American Free Trade Agreement. I think that's when I first became aware of you, Thea. The impact of international trade on U.S. wage equality and on domestic steel and textile industries. She's appeared on numerous television and radio shows. She's on the board of directors for the National Bureau of Economic Research. I am duly impressed. We then have Gawain Kripke, who is with Oxfam America. He's the Policy and Research Director at Oxfam America with over 20 years of experience in public policy advocacy. His department conducts research policy advocacy on the effectiveness of foreign aid and development, climate change, trade and agriculture, humanitarian issues, and extractive industries. And that's how you narrow the agenda at Oxfam. Kripke is a frequent commentator in all the important news outlets. He has testified before congressional committees. He was a senior policy advisor for Oxfam's Make Trade Fair campaign. Before joining Oxfam, he was Director of Economic Programs for Friends of the Earth. And I hired him when I happened briefly to be at Oxfam, and it was one of the best things I did there.
Thank you.
And I'm happy to say he's still there. Yeah. So I did something worthwhile and of lasting value. Then we have a commentator. Johannes Lin is here under duress. He says, but I don't think like the rest of you. So we're going to challenge him to differentiate himself from all of us and to stay awake in the late afternoon of a very humid day in Washington. Johannes has been a friend and a mentor when it comes to Central Asia. He's a resident senior scholar at the Emerging Markets Forum in Washington and a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings. He served as the chair of the IFAD 9 replenishment consultation. He was director of the Wolfenson Center for Development at Brookings for 5 years. Before that, he worked for a mere 3 decades at the World Bank. After 8 years of research on urban issues, he was country economist and economic advisor for East Asia. He was staff director, World Development Report, et cetera, et cetera. My goodness. He was the bank's vice president for financial policy and resource mobilization, and here we go, the best part, vice president for Europe and Central Asia. What I remember most distinctly, he said that if you are ever reborn poor, pray to God that you are not poor in Central Asia. And I thought, whoa, why? And then you go to Central Asia, and you have many, many, many degrees below zero in the winter and many degrees above zero in the summer. And you suddenly understand why. You would rather be poor in the tropics if you have to be poor. With this distinguished panel, I'm going to turn it over to Nancy. And my job is to be a gatekeeper, a timekeeper, and then to encourage questions from you all. So Nancy, thank you for instigating this.
Well, thank you very much, Jo Marie, and also to Nathan, who was such an ambitious organizer of this event. And I want to welcome you on behalf of Heinrich Böll Foundation. As Jo Marie said, we have offices in about 30 countries around the world, and the purpose of our G20 program is to enliven the work in our offices around the world and among their partners in influencing G20 issues as they relate to two things in particular. One, democratizing global governance, and that relates to our topic today of transparency and accountability. And secondly, sustainable and equitable development. I got off the plane on Saturday from my third trip to Mexico this year and have engaged in many civil society and think tank discussions with the Mexican government on all manner of topics, from agriculture to energy to you name it. And as some of you know, perhaps better than I, in Mexico, like in many countries, there are at least three segments of civil society. There's the insiders, there are the outsiders, and there are the way outsiders. And I've participated in all three. And so if I sound very schizophrenic, then you'll realize that I'm relating to these multiple tracks. And in addition to these groups of civil society, there's the Think Tank 20 of think tanks from the 20 countries, plus assorted others. And there's the Youth 20, the Girls 20, the Young Entrepreneurs 20, and various global networks. So you can think of the G20 now as being the sun around which these multiple planets are swirling, which raises lots of questions about accountability and transparency and so on that I'll try to elucidate. But I'll begin by telling the joke that I often share. I think Porter may have been there. I often share with government ministries. It's a joke that I learned in Peru about how to conjugate the verb to participate. I participate, you participate, he, she, it participates, we participate, they decide. And the purpose of many civil society interventions with government is to say all of the interaction that governments have with civil society is great, but without being part of the deciders, without having impact, is totally useless. And the U.S. probably scores the lowest in terms of interaction and engagement with civil society, but maybe Gawain can shine more light on that than I can. But the Mexican government and the Korean government, multiple governments have gotten increasingly active in reaching out to all these groups. But where the real action occurs is between the Business 20, the International Chamber of Commerce, the McKinsey and Company, and PricewaterhouseCoopers. It was very interesting to host a dinner a couple of months ago in Washington, where it was a wonderful occasion. We had representatives from the Labor 20, G20, Business 20, civil society. We had representatives of many of the 20s. And so I asked the representative of the Business 20 to give some remarks, thinking I would get some real gung-ho, the G20 is the greatest thing since sliced bread kind of presentation. And Gawain reminded me before we started that this was a guy that was really angry. He was angry because he said a couple of things. One is that the Mexicans, and if there are any Mexicans present, I'm happy to be corrected on this point, but it was his view that the Mexicans are inviting business celebrities to basically run the Business 20 show and interact with the G20. And he was upset also because he said that the World Economic Forum and McKinsey and Company basically run the agendas of the 8 task forces of the Business 20. And if you go up on the World Economic Forum or the McKinsey and Company websites, you'll see that the two institutions have worked with the largest transnational corporations in the world to develop sector strategies for water, for agriculture. The one for agriculture was announced at the G20, at the G8 summit at Camp David, the new alliance on food and nutrition, and it's basically the McKinsey and Company vision has been rolled out in 11 countries, and they were saying, as I understand it at the G8 summit, that they wanted to replicate it around the world. And they have these public-private partnership plans for every sector of the economy. So this compilation of business task force recommendations does not exist anywhere in the public domain, but you're welcome to my copies of it. It was supposed to be embargoed until yesterday, but it still has not been released. The International Chamber of Commerce is doing a phenomenal, amazing scorecard that makes it very clear the 54 actions that it wants the G20 to take immediately, especially an international investment agreement and stronger rules around FDI. So we're very concerned. The title of our latest update for June 2012 is IBOTA, a wedding between the G20 and the B20. Last week at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the vice president of the International Chamber of Commerce spoke and said that since the G20 had failed to set up a secretariat, the International Chamber of Commerce G20 Advisory Committee was willing to take this function over for them. But isn't this generous? That the Chamber of Commerce wants to run the G20 summits because the G20 itself has failed to set up a secretariat. I'm going to conclude with, do I have a couple more minutes? With some of the issues that are really burning on the civil society agenda, some of which are shared by the think tank 20. Number one, whether you're in the inside, outside, or way outside civil society groups, and by the way outside, I mean the Occupy and the Indignados who were in Mexico City in great numbers and ready to use social media and take anybody over 40 through a class in how to do social media really quickly. It was very interesting. But in all these groups, the legitimacy issue was profound. There is profound understanding that the G20 is not accountable to the larger body of nations, that it's not democratic like the United Nations is. Many groups do not understand that the G20 is less democratic than the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. Many groups don't understand that the headline stories of the G20 are all dominated by the Eurozone and the financial crisis, but there's a whole nother agenda that doesn't make it into the headlines on international development. And since we're talking about accountability, this is really important, because this second agenda that gets no headlines is about the developing countries. In 2010, the G20 created a development action plan for all the countries that are not members of the G20. And it is very heavy on infrastructure and food security, with almost no considerations for climate change and very few considerations for equity. I could go into excruciating detail, but I will restrain myself. So this agenda is not in the headlines. It's incredibly important. One of the executive directors of the IMF was saying last week that the G20 needed to remember that it was not in charge of redoing IMF governance. You'll be surprised to hear that he had this opinion, Joe Marie. he was saying that this is the job of the IMFC and the IMF's board. He didn't realize that the G20 have 66% of the IMF's vote, and they could just de facto impose a solution and save the IMF all of the problems of democratic process, of negotiating with little and powerless countries. The G20 could just like step right in, just like the Chamber of Commerce can step right in. So, you know, people are not really aware of the fact that in the Development Action Plan of the G20, it's a document that actually exists. There are mandates to 25 international and regional organizations. Mandates, not recommendations to their boards or advice from our experience, mandates. That goes around 173 countries that are not part of the G20. The next thing that, that really annoys civil society is the question of accountability for what? So many groups, in fact, if you go on the website of the Munk Center at the University of Toronto, I should have brought it, they just produced the most impressive book. It's about that thick with hundreds of fascinating essays on the G20. And, you know, what they do is they count how many commitments the G20 follows through on. Well, if you're talking about commitments like removing subsidies on fossil fuels while taking care of the most vulnerable people, that's great. But if you're not following through on a commitment to implement austerity with no accommodation for job creation or social protection or anything else in the world, hey, I'm for lack of accountability, you know, down with accountability. So it depends. Accountability for what? And in this volume of Business 20 recommendations, I'm just going to say two things, and that is that green growth, what does that mean for the Business 20 and the G20? I'm just going to say two things because it means many things, and there's a big fight in Rio about what it means. In fact, with Peter Riggs of the Ford Foundation, I just published a paper called The G20 Playing Outside the Big Tent that look at the implications of the G20 for what's going on in Rio at the 20th anniversary of the Earth Summit. The two things are as follows. The Business 20 expects to launch, and we should see this in the headlines tonight or tomorrow, what they were calling last week a Green Growth Alliance. What this would mean is that they would use unprecedented amounts of public money to leverage private investment in so-called green growth, which they give no criteria for. In fact, they go so far in this document as to propose that the performance of all national and multilateral development banks, which have now joined in a brand new club called the International Development Finance Club. There's a very interesting website, IDFC, that includes what this club of national and multilateral banks is doing. So the B20 is proposing that the performance, like if we go to the US Congress for money for the World Bank, that they be looking like everybody else should look at the performance of the World Bank in using public money to leverage private money. And the problem with that is that we all probably care about the triple bottom line of public-private partnerships, not just the economic, but the social and environmental. And so if the more leverage you have, the more private sector investment you have, the more delicate that balance gets about whether you can even find out what the bottom line is. And the second thing is the Sustainable Energy Trade Agreement that the B20 hopes to launch. It's a coalition of the willing that would launch this new plurilateral agreement. They also want to move along the plurilateral services agreement. And if you Google this scorecard of the International Chamber of Commerce, these trade and investment agreements are the #1 thing they want, and some of the trade agenda is good. It's not a black or a white situation, but I would suggest that the proposal as it stands is very dangerous, and things like removing requirements for local content, trade, non-trade barriers, that becomes very sensitive when you're dealing with the financialization of nature and of water and food and minerals and land and so on. I think a lot of people would agree that the environmental, labor, and social aspects of issues such as that should not be sidebars on any trade agreement. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I hope we have grist for Johannes. We will now ask Thea Lee to make a few remarks.
Bernardo is next.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Bernardo.
No problem.
No, Bernardo. Thank you. Thank you, Thea.
Thank you. Mary, show Mary, thank you.
Be sure to speak right into the mic.
Okay. Well, I'll express my personal views and not those of the organization I work at. So when we are talking about the G20, it is true that there are 173 countries that are not members of this group, that in fact unite only 19 countries, not 20. And the Latin American members of the G20 are Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina, and they are trying to enlarge the participation within the region. Mexico has invited Colombia and Chile to participate in the different meetings and working groups, while Spain has always been invited to participate. On the other hand, the finance or economic ministers of the Latin American countries at the G20, before any G20 ministerial meetings, invite all other ministers of the rest of the Latin American countries to meet to express their views on global issues, so that these views are taken to the G20 forums. I am participating on behalf of my country at the G20 Working Group on International Financial Architecture, and the last meeting in Istanbul of the group, on several Latin American countries have participated, and also countries like Benin in Africa were also invited. This working group was established under the Mexican presidency of the G20, acting as co-chairs Australia and Turkey. The working group has been given the task of pursuing 4 key goals: to ensure that the IMF has sufficient resources to meet the needs of all its members, to help strengthen surveillance by providing G20 input into the proposed new IMF decision on surveillance, to supervise progress on the implementation of the G20 action plan to support the development of local currency bond markets, and to facilitate the timely and full implementation of the 2010 IMF quota and governance reform package, and contribute to the comprehensive review of the quota formula, which is to be completed by January 2013. At the April meeting, G20 finance minister and central bank governors, together with the IMFC, announced firm commitments to increase IMF resources by over $430 billion, though firm commitments are in the amount of around $350 billion. And this is in addition to the quota increase under the 2010 quota and governance reforms that will increase the lending capacity of the fund by $250 billion. They reaffirm their commitment that the IMF should remain a quota-based institution, and the discussion now is how to finalize the modalities of the bilateral borrowing and purchase agreements and the conditions of their use. Prior to the crisis, the IMF surveillance was oriented to emerging markets and developing countries, including the poor, but now there are several initiatives to strengthen IMF surveillance, particularly of advanced countries, and within them, systemic countries. The IMF is preparing a new integrated surveillance decision to enhance the surveillance framework to include macro and multilateral surveillance. With regard to the action plan to support the development of local currency bond markets, a joint progress report on the action plan's implementation prepared by the World Bank, regional development banks, the IMF, UNCTAD, OECD, the Bank of International Settlements, and the Financial Stability Board will be present at the meeting in Los Cabos. The working group has been monitoring and regularly presenting progress in implementing the 2010 package and exerting peer pressure within the G20, where several countries have not yet approved the 2010 reform and quota review. Concerning the review of the quota formula, the working group provides input to the G20 Leaders Summit held today on the basic features to be considered in the review of the quota formula. However, there was no agreement in the working group on the advice on how the current quota formula, considered to have many flaws, must be revised and reformed. With the formula during the 2010 review, 6 of the 11 developing countries chairs at the IMF lost voting power, and the increase of voting power by BRICS countries was due not to voting power yielded by advanced countries, but to the losses of other developing countries, particularly medium-income developing countries like Argentina, Bolivia, Uruguay, South Africa, among others, who lost more than 25% of their quota share. As a matter of governance, a feature which is a concern is the increasing concentration of the quota share in the largest members of the fund. This not only represents an equity challenge, but also reflects a concrete weakness in the governance of the fund, deepening its democratic deficit. The concentration of quota share of the larger shareholders cannot be accepted, neither that the final decisions on quotas could continue to be made outside of the executive board, as was pointed out by Nancy. The G20 also direct this process, and this represents a lack of transparency and participation. For instance, the 2010 IMF quota review was decided at a G7 plus BRIC closed meeting within a G20 ministerial meeting in Korea. How do we get accountability for results? In different communiques, the leaders of the G20 have committed to work together to reinvigorate economic growth, create jobs, ensure financial stability, promote social inclusion, and make globalization serve the needs of the people. And we have a problem here. How do we get accountability for results when the words used have a different set of meaning and a different set of policy to be achieved? The basic words are growth, stability, employment, participation, and poverty reduction, and food security. But how should they be defined? With which qualifiers and which policies should be applied to obtain the required results? And how could the G20 be accountable for these results? Argentina in the G20 discussion has included in the communique to the word growth the word inclusive. And now it is said in most of the documents of the G20, inclusive growth, because the country has suffered for many years growth with an increase in unemployment and poverty and a regressive income distribution. And that kind of growth is not good for any country. But on the other hand, how can an increase in GDP growth be obtained with policies like adjustment, fiscal consolidation, structural reforms, or the European invention of a word as a mix of growth and austerity, words that are rather conflicting, because how can we get growth through austerity measures? Latvia is given as an example. Its GDP has fallen around 20%, and the economic reboot increases GDP by 5%, but it is far from the pre-crisis level. On the other hand, the Iceland case and how it dealt with the crisis and the debt problem was very quickly erased from the news because it was not a convenient example. Increasing employment is a must, but how can we increase quality employment on a global scale and not create jobs in one country at the expense of another? How can we recover the 50 million jobs lost since the crisis? And how can unemployment be diminished, particularly within the youth and young graduates? Moreover, flexibility is not a solution to unemployment. It aggravates the problem. In the short term, it aggravates the problem, and we know what happens in the long term. How can poverty be effectively reduced, both in poor and rich countries? How can true participation be achieved? And also, as Nancy mentioned, participation in the decisions, how participation in the decisions can be achieved. Because participation is not easy. It is also tricky because we can ask who are those participating. For instance, now the IMC Secretariat is calling for more private participation. And what does that mean for them? It means corporation and private sector-related institutions. Thus, this is a forum where small and medium-sized enterprises and civil society organizations should also participate. Infrastructure for development can be a solution to many of these problems, not only in emerging market developing countries, but also in advanced countries where much of their infrastructure is already obsolete. One point that should be given due attention is the problem of income distribution caused by the policies applied, not only at the country level, but on a global scale. And finally, I agree that civil society groups should have sufficient access to information about the working groups and the summit's policy agenda of the G20 to participate in informed and constructive ways, and that the G20 preparatory process should be organized in such a way that interested parties have opportunities for meaningful consultation in advance of the final decision-making processes. Thank you.
Wondered why I invited him, huh? Thank you, Bernardo. That's kind of breathtaking. And now, Thea?
Thank you so much, Jo Marie. Thank you, everybody, for being here this afternoon, to the Heinrich Böll Foundation for organizing the event. And I'd like to start by just stipulating two things about the G20. And one is that when you start with this concept of the G20, the group of 20, that you are inherently starting with an arbitrary grouping. That, you have the G8, which was too small and too elite. You have the G, whatever, there's no G 193, but, the full group of governments, which would be unwieldy. And I think we can agree that it might be difficult to have any kind of an intelligent conversation with that larger group. And then you have the G20, which expands from the G8 to include some large developing countries, but, hasn't found the right balance between manageability and the ability to get things done and inclusivity, and probably not. And then the second thing is that if you're talking about a group of governments, you're not really talking about an international organization with a staff like the United Nations or the International Labor Organization or the World Trade Organization or UNCTAD or World Bank, IMF, or the OECD. You're talking about something else, which is a group of governments that come together periodically to address common problems, global economic problems. And so, in that sense, the G20 is hard to sink one's teeth into, and it is basically, I think, for most of us, and certainly for unions, for the labor movement, our primary source of influence is going to be our own government, as it should be. So, each civil society group, each union, each business organization is going to start by trying to influence its own government, and then your government goes off to this meeting, goes into a room. Is it a closed room? And how are decisions made? And how is the agenda set? All those questions are of enormous importance, certainly to my members, but to everybody, because as Nancy said, decisions are being made to impact financial regulation or macroeconomic issues. But the other thing I wanted to stipulate is that I don't know very much about the G20, because you all scheduled this meeting for the time when all the folks in my office who are familiar with the G20, who go to the meetings, are there. They're in Los Cabos. So my boss, President Richard Trumka, is in Los Cabos with Kathy Feingold, our International Affairs Director, and the two of them, and sometimes Damon Silvers, our Policy Director, have actually been at most of the G20 meetings. I don't go. I'm left at home to mind the store. But I do have a lot of experience with other international organizations, like the World Trade Organization, when that used to be my primary job at the AFL-CIO, is trying to influence my own government and the overall organization, and trying to counterbalance and counterweight the influence of business, the multinational corporations that, as Nancy was laying out, kind of walk through the door with a certain amount of weight and a certain amount of I guess, assumed influence that is there. And so in some ways, it's interesting for the labor organizations, the unions. We have a couple of structures that are parallel to the G8. We have the TUAC, the Trade Union Advisory Committee to the OECD. So those are the union representatives, the heads of the unions that represent the OECD countries. We have the ITUC, the International Trade Union Confederation, which is, of course, the national labor centers of all the major countries. And so in some ways, that gives, I'd say, the labor organizations a different entry point from civil society organizations or development organizations or environmental organizations that don't tend to have such established international bodies where they can, elect leaders and set priorities and so on. But even then, I think the G20 process has been tremendously frustrating for unions, because we've seen, as this process has grown and has become more regularized and more influential, that two groups, the finance ministers and the business organizations, have dominated the agenda. And so in some ways it seems like the labor groups have been fighting to have an equal voice at the table to build what we call the L20, as Nancy and Joe Marie were talking about. The L20 is obviously the labor leaders of the G20 countries, and then the B20. And there has actually been, in the last couple of meetings, I guess beginning in Cannes, an official establishment of a labor presence at the G20. And And we hope that that's been somewhat useful. What we've tried to do with our labor voice at the G20 is to put forward a different perspective. I guess I would step back for just 1 minute to say that I think in a time of global economic crisis, I think you can make an argument that you need an organization like the G20, or you need a forum. I guess that's really all G20 is a forum. It's a meeting, you know, a predetermined set of meetings that are going to happen between heads of state and other leaders, whether it's finance ministers or labor ministers, to address questions of macroeconomic coordination. How is the global economy together going to come together to get out of the global economic crisis? And I think it's crystal clear that we can't have individual countries making decisions about stimulus and macroeconomic policies and hoping to be effective, or trade policies or investment policies that we do need, especially the big countries. And that's why there's a rationale, there's a reason why you want the biggest countries, whether they're developing countries or emerging countries or industrialized countries, to come together into one room and put their heads together and come up with a solution. Unfortunately, they've often come up with the wrong solution because I think there's been an undue influence of conventional economic wisdom, some would call neoliberal economic wisdom, which is that what we really need to do is figure out how we can have more fiscal austerity and more enforcement of a fiscal austerity for everybody. And that, if you sort of wake up and read the papers this morning, you can see that's a lot of what the Eurozone is struggling with. It's certainly what the United States is struggling with in, you know, down the road in Congress and at the White House. So the messages from the labor leaders at the G20 meeting are pretty clear. And the first one, and it's the one I think that our folks have made at every single one of the G20 meetings, whatever they get, and they are able to convey their message in a couple of different ways. I mean, there are some meetings, but they generally, each labor leader tries to get an audience with their head of state for the L20 leaders, or some group of them. And sometimes we're successful and sometimes we aren't. So there's this interesting series of meetings with Angela Merkel and Sarkozy, or now Francois Hollande, and sometimes with Barack Obama. And the main thing, so the message has always been, we need to reorient from austerity to jobs and growth. That the problem that the global economy is facing today is a demand shortage. And we're not going to fix the demand shortage if we cut everybody's budget and tighten our belts. We're just going to make it worse. And relatedly, we need to address inequality and wage stagnation. That the growing inequality, certainly we see it here in the United States in a big way, but it's a problem not just in the United States but around the world. The growing gap between the rich and the poor is actually exacerbating the demand shortage, because we know that the people at the very top of the income distribution save a lot of their income. They don't spend it. If you give more income, either in the form of good wages that are growing as productivity grows, or in the form of social safety nets so that folks can afford to have decent, they can feed their kids and have a decent retirement and so on, then you will actually inject more spending into the economy, which is what you need at a time like the present. The third thing, obviously, is to re-regulate the financial system, and that's the work of many people in this room, to address the too-big-to-fail banks. And again, these are issues that are better dealt with in an internationally coordinated way, rather than having each country try to address these individually. So in that sense, you can say there ought to be something like a G20, but how can we make that G20 more responsive, more open, more accountable, more democratic, and also address tax havens? Because you can't have a rational taxation policy in one country. I mean, you've heard the debate that happens in the U.S. Congress as we try to have a rational discussion about either ending the Bush tax cuts for the wealthy, or getting rid of some of the loopholes that allow the wealthiest Americans to pay lower taxes than their secretaries and bus drivers, or trying to raise taxes from the corporate sector, which is paying a lower percentage of GDP in tax revenues than they've ever paid. But whenever you talk about trying to raise a little bit of taxes on the corporate sector, you hear the same thing. You hear it from the Treasury Department, you hear it from the White House, and you hear it from Congress, which is, we can't do that because all the companies will move somewhere else. And that's why you do need to figure out, especially if you get the major players, the major countries in the room, you can see that there could be a constructive conversation about rational taxation that would help get the global economy going again. The fourth thing is the financial transactions tax. And I know everybody in this room is well aware of the attempts that we've had on the civil society side to bring people together, to put pressure on all of our governments at once to move in this direction of trying to figure out how you can put a tiny little tax on financial transactions so that you can raise some of the money that you need for urgent demands, whether in development or environment or simply getting the economy going again. And the fifth piece is to enhance the participation, to change the G20 process so that the voices of labor and civil society organizations are given a fair shot at rebalancing that conversation. And we've also, one of the things that the labor movement has done in the G20 process has been to insist that labor ministers meet as part of the G20 meeting, not just the finance ministers and the heads of state, but that the labor ministers are there. And we have found that that has some beneficial impact, that even within governments, the voice of labor ministers are often represent a different constituency, a different perspective than the voice of finance ministers who are looking for that. So that is, those are the points that I wanted to make about the importance of using the forum that exists to the extent that the G20 countries will meet, will get together. We have to use both our own avenues within our country to influence our government, and then also coordinate with other like-minded groups, whether it's in unions or civil society more broadly, to see if we can encourage this group to move in a direction of addressing the concerns of working people and the poor, as well as financial stability. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leah. Well, we've heard Nancy set out the agenda of the issues. Bernardo has talked about what it's like to be part of the further in than the inside civil society groups can be, but still there's a lot of dissatisfaction on what's actually happening in terms of who has leverage and who is setting the agenda. Thea has said, well, let's see what we can do to make this forum work. It exists. What can we do to make it do the right thing? Gawain, the agenda is yours.
Okay, well.
We want some answers.
That's why I'm here. I'm here to answer all your concerns. Thanks, Jo Marie and Henrik Bull, Nancy, for organizing the event. I do feel a little bit like the kid in Home Alone. Everybody else went out to the big party, and here we are talking about it. And if Thea says that she's home minding the shop while all the experts are there, I'm probably less than a second-string player on the G20 at the moment. All our experts are either in Mexico or in the audience. In some ways, I don't have that much to add to some of the very thorough and good presentations by my co-panelists here. But maybe I'll offer a few reflections and maybe a couple provocations to talk about. So we can debate about whether or not the G20 is a good idea. And that's a fun argument to have. And as a matter of ideology, I would say that Oxfam has a presumptive no. I mean, the presumption is that the G20 is an illegitimate body because it is not fully inclusive, is not democratic, is not fully transparent, and so forth. And generally, we want to support multilateralism and transparency and rule by law and all of that. And so we start with a skeptical view of the G20, just as we have of other sort of ad hoc groupings of countries like the G8. And yet we have some hope for them. And think that there can be a justification for them if they deliver outcomes that are important and good. And so this is the rationale for working on the G20 and the G8 and other groupings like that is they are legitimized by their effectiveness in delivering outcomes. And for both the G20 and the G8, there's a question that this legitimacy has come to some question because they haven't been delivering that much, especially in recent years. In the wake of the initial financial crisis, some argued that the G20 played an important role in bringing attention and some concerted action, or at least concerted attention from all the key countries and so forth, and that it was a better grouping, certainly, than the G8 would have been, for example, to pay attention to these crises. And in the past, the G8 has indeed delivered some important outcomes, at least in my sector, around development and poverty reduction. But both of them have gotten a bit stale in the last few years. And so I think it's fair to question whether they're delivering and whether, as platforms, they're effective. And I think it's an opportunity for us to put pressure on them to deliver. So the G20 has taken some of the lessons of the G8. Over the years, the G8 started from sort of a fireside chat club to something a bit more formalized with a bit more process. And the G20 is taking over kind of where the G8 left off, at least in form, or maybe in rhetoric, in terms of accountability and setting up subgroups to do work in the between the summits and so forth. But as other speakers have noted, they don't have any corpus. They are just the heads of state that meet, and occasionally they're delegates or delegates who meet in the interim. So they don't really have the power to generate analysis, to write law, to do this kind of thing. And they have liberally impose themselves over other institutions to mandate or request that other institutions take on their agenda. And that's potentially a problem when you have this fundamentally unmandated, unauthorized organization setting the agenda, setting the work plan for other institutions that do at least have bylaws and so forth. So the IMF is the biggest case in point, which has been really embraced and I think is hugging back the G20 because it's given it a real mandate and a renewed sense of life. But many others are doing it. There's a fear that the G20 might overreach, might set an agenda that is offensive or problematic for other institutions. But I think there's also a risk in the other direction, which is that the G20 may set too low a standard, too low an expectation, and other institutions then defer to the G20. And we observe this a bit in the area of food security, where despite having food security on its agenda, the G20 actually has produced very little of any real substance on the issue of food price volatility and food security. And we have observed that in other venues where we hope to see progress, like the UN agencies in Rome, the Committee on World Food Security, the G20 keeps coming up in conversation, where we say, well, we really ought to be taking more action on biofuels, for example. The response is, well, the G20 kind of looked at it and decided not to do anything, so we're going to kind of leave that off the agenda. So in that case, it shows that the G20 can actually set bars too low. If they decide to decline to take action, that means other institutions will defer to that passivity, and so the G20 may not just be setting a bar that's sort of a floor, but maybe also a ceiling for action by other institutions. So that's a dynamic that we're watching and worried about, that if the G20 is ineffective, does that also begin to preclude action from other institutions and other agencies? The experience this year was interesting between the G20 and the G8. And since the topic is transparency and accountability, I think we had a really, I think we saw in some ways the maturation of sort of the middle-income leadership and the real neglect or drift by the developed countries, in this case the U.S. and Mexico, were real contrasts in terms of how they approached their respective summits. In the case of the U.S., the administration, and I don't know if there's anyone here from the administration or the government, so I'll try to be somewhat diplomatic about this, but the administration really didn't lead.
No one's here from the government. Go for it.
Good. Well, then I'll let loose. The administration did, we think, a very poor job of signaling its ambitions, of laying out a course of action, of organizing other countries and leaders to take part, and most importantly, for the purposes of this panel, of consulting and discussing these issues with civil society. For months, Oxfam and many others tried to have an engagement with the administration about the agenda around the G8, what could be done, because we wanted something ambitious. We hoped for some leadership and ambition out of the G8, and with President Obama in charge, we thought maybe this is a real opportunity. And yet, we really got very, very little in terms of an engagement, even less in terms of a formal process of consultation and discussion publicly. And in the end, had some ad hoc meetings here and there. I guess Mike Froman came to Brookings and did an event the day or two before the G8 meeting, but that was pretty much it. You didn't really get a sense of what the administration was about, what they were looking for, what they were trying to get others to do, and how we could help, or at least know about it going into it. Now, Mexico has been a real contrast to that. They've done quite a lot of outreach, and although Mexican civil society is quite diverse in terms of its approach to the government and engaging with government processes, our view is that you really have to hand it to the Mexican Sherpa and the whole G20 apparatus for trying to do outreach, for participating in events, for putting out materials early that signaled their intentions or at least their ambitions, and for really doing, I think, a model job of communications and publications. My colleague Porter, who's in the audience, did a little tabulation of the U.S. versus Mexico, and it was something like 15-0 between Mexico and the United States, with the U.S. scoring 0.
Soccer game.
Yeah, well, that would be a pretty bad soccer game, but maybe U.S. versus Mexico would end up 15-0. And I mean, even little things like having the Sherpa be on Twitter and communicating on Twitter about the G20 agenda, and setting up a website where a lot of documents were posted. These are the kinds of things that really help and add some legitimacy, some credibility, some communication, some consultation to these processes, and that can be really important. And the U.S. took a real pass on it, and Mexico did a good job. We're happy that Mexico did, especially because as the leadership of the G20 moves from country to country, we need to start setting, we hope to start setting standards for participation and communication. And the G20 will be moving into countries that don't have a strong history here, a strong track record. And so setting an example here that we can hold up is pretty important. So all this is to say that that the leadership of the host country is really important. And when the host country doesn't lead, you can expect that there to be very little in terms of outcomes. And when the host country does lead, you might not get much in terms of outcomes, but it seems like a necessary but probably not sufficient component for delivery of real outcomes to the summits and to the process. The G20 is inherently more difficult because it has more participants and the participants are more diverse. So it's also newer as a heads of state forum, and it's clearly still working out how to do business and how to participate. Some countries have well-established sort of Sherpa processes and so forth, and other countries don't. And so over time, we may see this mature and become more formalized in the process better, or we might not. There's a bit of capture in the G20, I think, in terms of ministries involved. And even until recently, the U.S. The participation by the U.S. in the G20 was really through Treasury exclusively. State Department was not deeply involved. They were kind of outside observers, sometimes would come in. And for us, we think that's a problem, because if finance ministries have important purposes, of course, but the whole cross-sector of issues is important to try to include, and we tend to often be weaker in terms of pushing our agendas in finance ministries or with Treasury than we would with state or USAID or other agencies. So figuring out how to unlock the agenda from finance ministries to be broader and have the finance track not be the hegemonic track within the G20 is important. There is a development track, but most observers think it's sort of an add-on, an appendix to the G20 meetings, not really core to the agenda. Okay, so I've covered our disappointment, the contrast between Mexico and the United States, and the risk of the G20 being too ambitious and dominating other institutions, but also the risk of the G20 setting the bar too low. Those are some of the points I wanted to try to add to the conversation. I wanted to comment a little bit on Nancy's example of the dinner with the German, I think it was the Confederation of Industries, I forget, it was the German private sector. It was such a relief to hear him complain about feeling excluded from the B20 and therefore the G20 process. I thought it was only NGOs that felt excluded, and to hear business also feeling excluded made me feel some relief that at least we're all excluded equally, or maybe that's not quite fair, but this the dominance of certain institutions in terms of delivering voices and inputs into these processes is an ongoing problem, and something that we don't have an easy solution to, but something also to watch carefully. And Oxfam is often one of the more engaged, and so we try to have to watch ourselves and make sure that we are participating collaboratively, even though it's less convenient to do so, and trying to make sure we include all three sectors, the crazies, the really crazies, and the insiders. We tend to fund the crazies and the really crazies, and then we tend to act like the insiders. So that's Oxfam's operating model. So maybe I'll stop there. I think the discussion and conversation might be the best part of this this session, but I'll stop there with those comments.
Turn off, yeah. I'd like to now offer, first, thank you, Gawain, and thank you for meeting with the crazies and the really crazies this afternoon. At least he's in good company, huh? We're much more entertaining than the insiders, much more entertaining. And now, Johannes.
Thank you, thank you.
Are you the insider, the crazy, or the really crazy?
I don't know. Depends on the situation, but today maybe the way you set it up, I'm the crazy outsider from this group. Anyway, maybe, I don't know. I hope I won't disappoint you. But it so happens that my colleague in arms, Colin Bradford, is also at Los Cabos today for think tanks. Exactly what he's doing there, I have no idea, but I'm sure he's influencing the outcome and is part of the decision-making process. Of course, I'm back here, home alone, so I feel suitably neglected and quite mad at being excluded.
Johannes, we threw a party for all the home aloners.
Exactly. So let me make a few points that may be relevant. So listening, and I think my notes were prepared before, so I was maybe not entirely off in expecting what I was going to hear, but I'll try to tailor it a bit to the specifics. And let me say the main reason I attended today was because I wanted to listen, because I actually hadn't thought much about the issues. In fact, while having been engaged on G20 matters until it was set up, because we argued fervently for it as against the G8, rather than as for an ideal outcome, which it clearly isn't. But since then, I've sort of moved on a bit, but it's nice to come back and hear some of the concerns, because I think they're real, and I think they're important, and we should address them as best we can. However, let me start by saying that, in my view, today, the global governance issues are actually secondary in importance. I think the biggest threat today is for global welfare, to employment, to poverty reduction, is the collapse of growth and depression, potential depression in the industrial world, with its, of course, attendant potential impact on developing countries. The biggest obstacle, in my view, to effective global governing and economic policy is not the failure or the stalemate of the global institutions, but it's the failure of democratic institutions, industrial democracies, and the political stalemate in the US, in Europe, and Japan, which have made effective policy response seemingly, at least, I hope I'm wrong, but it seems to me virtually impossible. So the key engagement for political and intellectual activism and for accountability of leaders, in my views, at the national level, in industrial economies. The current election cycle is absolutely critical. I think there was progress in France. Now we see US, of course, the elections upcoming, and Germany. And I think it's interesting that we have sort of organizing this, a US and a German NGO or think tank, whatever, how you define yourselves, because I actually think the US and the Germany, in the next 12 to 24 months are absolutely critical. And if they get it wrong in terms of the policy decisions, in terms of political outcomes of elections, I think we're all in deep trouble. So I'd like you to think about what you can do, we can do, to actually convince the German and the US in the first place, then the German electorates, that sensible growth policies must be followed to avoid disaster. I think that's a good question to ponder, and now it goes beyond the particular topic of today, but I'm afraid if we sort of think by fixing the global governance problems, we can fix the global economic policy making problems, I think we got it fundamentally wrong. It's a secondary order of business. So we really have to think about how do we fix the malaise in the industrial democracies that seem unable across the board to make effective economic policies. Hopefully it's temporary, but for now it seems to be a reality. So what do we do about the G20 governance issues, since this is the current discussion? And actually, Nancy reminded us that in terms of the long-term, not crisis management, but long-term decisions that are currently being pursued, there may be impacts that we need to watch. And so I think the whole question of legitimacy, of transparency and accountability remains relevant. I just would say, to me, it's not as urgent these days as perhaps we make it sometimes sound, us who have an interest in fixing the global governance issue. Let's remember that's our business, so we're interested in it, so we're arguing for it as an important issue. It is important, but I think it's secondary. But let's talk about membership legitimacy issue that was raised repeatedly. I actually liked, I think it was Gawain who said that, we do have fear that we have, in fact, to think about both the representativeness and the effectiveness. And from my perspective, having thought about this quite a bit, my sense is a G20 is probably not a bad sort of forum in terms of size of bodies around a table, although they tend to be more. They end up being around 30, I believe, in practice. But that's probably about as large as you can get for effective discussion and whenever there are decision making. Now, that doesn't mean that as we think about the trade-off between representativeness and efficiency, we shouldn't think creatively how representativeness can be improved and push hard, as I think you were saying, for increased effectiveness, because obviously if a body is ineffective, then it also is likely to have low, at whatever size, frankly, whether it's UN size or whether it's a G1, is likely to have little legitimacy as a decision-making body. Now, where do I come out? My sense is, for now anyway, I would let the G20 be where it is at the current level of size, not throw Argentina out, which some have argued, but leave it in there for now. Maybe that's an argument to be had later. Europeans, of course, are overrepresented like they always are, so they probably, if anything, ought to be replaced or condensed to perhaps for even a greater effectiveness. So there are lots of issues. Indeed, my question to you all, and I haven't really heard anything, so what do you propose as an alternative? See, if we can all bitch and moan about the terrible G20, but if we don't have a specific alternative that we believe addresses the limitations of legitimacy, then I think we really are going to be not very effective. So I'd like to know, do you think larger numbers, more outreach, a constituency system, or regional representation a bit more effectively organized today? So tell us a bit more about what's your answer, Nancy, to that problem. I think you're one of them who raised it. Same issue actually with transparency. My sense is, as I sort of look at all of your bosses or important partners are out there participating, including my own partner, in terms of my professional work on G20 issues. So, if there's so many people actually in Los Cabos, and, why they're there? Presumably because they think they have some influence, that they actually can, and they have some information on which they can get. A lot of stuff, Nancy, you have a lot of information, you share some of it with us. I'm all in favor of more transparency. Much more would be, I'm sure, be great. But let me also say the fact that you now had in Cannes, it was 3 statements of the leaders, a communique, an action plan, and a declaration, and you had about 15 reports, official reports that were published as annexes or whatever. Frankly, I think is overkill in terms of, leaders actually putting out their important pieces of information that they think they represent, because I'm sure half the stuff, or 90% of the stuff that was put out, the leaders actually don't agree on or don't really support. So I think, again, what we need, and let me be brief here, be specific about where is the lack of transparency. What do you want to get more of? So please tell us, and because you've thought about it, and to be effective in terms of critics, to be effective as an agent of change, I believe we have to be much more specific. Thirdly, accountability. Yes, I think it's very important to keep track of commitments and of delivery. And I think what we as on the outside, as the sort of the non-governmental body, think tanks, NGOs, the Oxfams, the Burroughs Foundation, so on, we need to think about, so what is a platform that we could get together on that would actually keep track of the things we care about? Okay, so business is no good. They care about stuff we think is unimportant or actually wrong-headed and dangerous. So what do we care about? So why don't we set up? Is it maybe interaction? Is it think tank something or other? So, what are we doing to set up some kind of a sort of countervailing accountability mechanism? So maybe it's there and I just don't know about it, but then please tell us so we can also help make it work. In sum, I think the focus in the next year or two will be on the global crisis. I think and it has to be solved in the national context, and there I'm not at all optimistic given what I see happening in Europe and in the US in particular, in Germany also. I think we need to bundle the voices at the national level and ultimately, to the extent possible, at the international level, and focus on specific proposals to change the governance of the G20. So that would be my sense of where we need to go. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Johannes. You all have been listening very attentively, and what I'd like to do is sort of reverse course. Instead of having a little interaction among the panelists, we have a lot of talented people who have come to spend time this afternoon on an important issue. I'd like to hear what you're thinking and what your issues are, whether you've got solutions, you've got priority complaints, you wish you were in Los Cabos on the beach. What is on your mind? Do we have a roving microphone?
Yeah.
Okay, Nathan has the microphone, and we will, I'm going to take a batch of questions. I do ask you, please, for future generations, be clear about your name and organization, because posterity will have access to these video recordings. Keep them brief, because there are a lot of people here, and we all are very smart and opinionated, so go for it.